Welcome and thank you everybody for coming tonight. My name is Ricardo Martinez, he, him pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director of GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders, also known as GLAD Law. Tonight, we are joined by partners and constituents from 45 different states. Over 1,600 people registered to be in community tonight to understand the implications of recent executive orders on our daily lives and to get answers to questions that are on the minds of so many people in our community at this time. For many LGBTQ plus people, our families, and the people who love us, the last few weeks have been encapsulated by worry, growing concern around safety, and anxiety around unanswered questions about how we navigate everyday life. And make no mistake, we will always find a way to navigate life because we always have. But that truth is separate and apart from the fact that knowingly causing harm to any community is antithetical to public service and unspeakably cruel. Intentionally using the weight of the most powerful office in this country to undermine our rights and place a bullseye on the backs of marginalized communities violates the Constitution's promise to promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty for all. As a gay Mexican-American person who immigrated to the United States at the age of 6 and who benefited from DEI programs at critical inflection points in my life, I truly mourn for what was and what is unraveling before us. I, like many of you, am feeling sadness and, in all honesty, more so anger. In practice, these executive orders may endanger the lives of millions of people, separate families, make access to necessary healthcare even harder than it already is, eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, impose limits on discussions of certain identities in schools, and target whole populations and families as inappropriate. And as we were preparing for today, we saw another shocking executive order pausing grants, loans, and other federal aid. Knowingly causing harm to any community is not public service. In moments of temporary hopelessness, I anchor myself in the truth of who we are, and there is no executive action that can change the fact that transgender, lesbian, gay, bisexual, intersex, and queer people are vital members of our families and our communities. And like all people, deserve dignity, respect, and the freedom to live without fear of government-sanctioned harm. GLAD Law is here to fight, as we have in the immediate aftermath of the first week post-inauguration. I am so incredibly proud of our entire staff and our board in their efforts to file a challenge to this administration's transgender military ban, and for being the first to file a challenge to sections 4A and 4C of the Executive Order 14166, which unlawfully seeks to house transgender women in men's prisons. Tonight, we will try to answer many of your questions as best as we can and keep people informed as things evolve. Thank you for being part of our community. Tonight, we are joined by some of the incredible people that are on the GLAD Law team. Polly Crozier, Director of Family Advocacy, who will drill down on Executive Order overview and passports and IDs. Ben Klein, our Senior Director of Litigation and HIV Law, who will talk to us about prisons, the military, and healthcare. And Mary Bonauto, Senior Director of Civil Rights and Legal Strategies, who will discuss schools, marriage, and families. We will then take questions and give some advice on things that people can do in the short term to contribute to the movement, to not necessarily feel as helpless as you might feel right now. To get us started and make the best of this hour, I'm going to turn it over to Polly. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Ricardo, and thank you to everybody for being here. I know it's a really difficult day, difficult week. I'm just going to do a couple things. And first is just to share some really basic information about executive orders. And of course, always invite my other panelists to chime in as well. An executive order is essentially a directive issued by the president, ostensibly to clarify matters within his authority, right? They're usually directives to federal agencies to guide their work. Of course, there's really no usually at this moment. Trump has issued so many executive orders and so many outrageous ones that really blatantly target people. We know people are incredibly worried, so to be expected. I just want to share, in terms of the law, an executive order doesn't change federal law. It doesn't also change the Constitution, and it doesn't impact how courts should interpret both federal law and the Constitution. Also, state law still exists, and in many areas can address some key concerns that we've heard from community members. So they are executive orders. These are designed to shock, to awe, to cause confusion. They're doing that. And we need to remember that the law, the Constitution remains. So just a really brief overview of one of the executive orders. I know my colleagues will provide some overview of the others. One is the gender ideology executive order that issued a few days ago. And that really seeks to try to make sweeping changes, sweeping legal barriers to transgender people's to make their lives more difficult. I mean, it has some immediate impacts, and some of its impacts are just broader and vaguer, and we will, will evolve over time. And again, I think always we're going to try to stay ahead of things, be a source of information. Obviously, finding reputable sources of information at this time are really important. A few of the key pieces of this order, it requires the State Department and Homeland Security to stop issuing passports, visas, consular reports of birth abroad that reflect a transgender person's accurate gender. It requires the Bureau of Prisons to deny incarcerated people healthcare and appropriate housing. It asks HUD to reverse rules that give transgender people fair and safe access to shelters. It tells federal agencies employees essentially to enforce laws about sex-based rights, really in just two narrow categories of male and female. It essentially says federal agencies should remove any mention of gender identity from language and forms and stop funding anybody who promotes kind of a gender ideology. It, of course, it's a long document. It does a lot of things. Those are just the highlights. And process-wise, it says that the president will, or the president's legislative person will propose a bill within 30 days to codify the order. And it provides that agencies have 120 days to submit a plan to implement the order. Now, of course, some of the agencies are moving faster than others. And I'm going to share a little bit with you about what's happening with gender markers, because we have heard from a lot of folks with questions about gender markers on federal documents. And as you may know, GLAD Law has an ID project that provides pro bono legal counsel for people looking to change their gender markers on state and federal identity documents. And so that program remains available to people. Of course, there's quite a bit of demand at the moment, but we have a lot of really wonderful pro bono resources directed to support people in this area. So first, the order directs the Secretaries of State and Homeland Security to modify passport, visa, global entry policies, right? What's the bottom line? Already, Secretary Rubio has issued a directive, so passports have stopped being issued using gender markers. And amendments and updates to gender markers in general on passports have stopped. And the Social Security Administration is no longer allowing gender marker updates. Now, you can still change your name on your passport and on your Social Security card. So name change is still available, not gender marker change. Here's what we don't know and we're still watching. And again, we have a lot of eyes on this, which is the EO doesn't specifically address existing documents. Until we have clarity on that, we are under the impression that previously issued documents should remain valid through their expiration dates. And for renewals for transgender people who have previously changed their gender markers, i.e., so they're not submitting additional birth records, it's not a change in that moment, we're uncertain what's going to happen. Sorry, there's uncertainty, but we're keeping an eye out again, and we'll update our guidance as much as possible. And so we're waiting to see what happens with people who we know are in the pipeline for applications who are pending. And I want to say, well, of course, having a mismatch between state and federal ID documents could make things more complicated. There's been no directives yet that people can't travel, right? Or that IDs that don't match your presentation or your identity mean that you can't travel. So for folks are experiencing mistreatment from the TSA or having difficulties in traveling, obviously we welcome you to let GLAD answers know, so we can be aware of what's happening on the ground. And I also just want to share birth certificates, right? Birth certificates are state issued documents. So to the extent that you live in a state that allows gender markers to be updated on birth certificates, that is still possible. Your state law impacts that. Um, so again, this area is evolving and we're doing our best to provide information as fast we can. We suggest that people keep copies of all your current identity documents. Make sure to stay in touch with LGBTQ organization about, hey, what you're experiencing so we know, and what we know that so you can learn from it from us. It's a two-way street at this point. And consider if visa issue is your issue, consider consulting an immigration attorney. And again, GLAD Law can provide referrals to attorneys. So I'm going to pass it off now to Ben.
Thank you, Polly, and thank you, Ricardo, both for your remarks. And thank you, everyone, for being here to really get some information on this really unprecedented time that we find ourselves in, but also to hear about what we're doing, because we are going to challenge each of these provisions that harm our community. And as Polly described in terms of the executive order, there are some very broad directives in the order, but there are also some very specific provisions directing federal agencies to do specific things. One of the things that became very clear right after Trump signed the order on January 20th was we learned that this administration is going to do what the executive order says. This is not political theater. This is impacting people's lives right now. So, for example, as Polly mentioned, one of the components of the executive order directs the Attorney General and the Bureau of Prisons to ensure that males, right, as the executive order defines sex, that males are not housed in women's prisons, essentially saying transgender women shall not be housed in women's prisons. Within a day of Trump signing that order, GLAD Law began receiving reports that transgender women who had been placed in women's prisons for the entire duration of their incarceration for their safety, right? That is the determination of the Bureau of Prisons, that was the safe setting for these transgender women. They were being removed from the general population, thrown into segregation, which is essentially solitary, and then told that they were going to be transferred to male correctional facilities. This was on pretty much one day after Trump signed the order. On Sunday night, this past Sunday night, GLAD Law, along with National Center for Lesbian Rights and a great team of lawyers at the law firm Lowenstein Sandler, filed an emergency lawsuit in federal court in Massachusetts on behalf of a transgender woman who was housed in a women's prison and was being told that she was going to be transferred imminently to a male correctional facility. We sought an emergency order prohibiting that transfer. And as some people know, there's a federal judge on call 24/7, and we may be using those emergency judges a lot more than we ever have in the past. The case is pending in federal court. It has been reported on in the press because the complaint was available for a very short time before the court sealed the case to public access, mostly because the judge just wanted to get a handle on what was going on and make sure that all the privacy protections were in place. But we anticipate that you'll be hearing more about that case in the coming days and weeks. And it is really a critical case as the first challenge to any aspect of this executive order. At GLAD Law, we know the incredible harm and how barbaric it is to place someone who is a woman in a male correctional facility. In 2018, we actually filed a lawsuit, the first lawsuit in the country, in seeking to arrange or get an order for the transfer of a transgender woman who was housed in a male correctional facility in Massachusetts to a appropriate women's setting. And what our client, who was a trans woman who had fully transitioned, experienced in a male prison was being strip searched by male correctional officers, having no showering privacy, being subjected to harassment and taunts, and living daily with the threat of sexual violence. So we know that this is very real harm that we are seeking to prevent. The executive order also has a provision prohibiting gender transition medical care in any federal prison. We have not yet heard reports of that happening, but we do expect that could happen without court intervention, and that is part of our lawsuit pending in Massachusetts. One of the things people should know generally in many of the areas that we're talking about tonight, we're not writing on a blank legal slate. There has been a lot of litigation in many of these areas that provide us a solid foundation for challenging these provisions. And one of the areas of law that is really well developed is that denying people who are incarcerated, when you have no freedom to get your own health care, the state has control of you, denying people medical care for serious medical needs violates the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. So we will be seeking to enforce all of these aspects of our constitutional protections. The other thing I think that's really important to keep in mind with these executive orders that are coming fast and furious is that it's not just about harming transgender people. I mean, that is horrific enough what we are seeing. But these orders that are erratic, sudden, and just sort of coming out of the blue, jettisoning policies that have been carefully developed in a variety of institutions, including prison settings, are really destabilizing for all of our institutions in our society. Because what they're doing is they are just like that, casting aside the very careful assessments that have been made by people in correctional facilities to develop the policies about how to safely house people and maintain order in correctional settings. So you'll be hearing much more about that lawsuit going ahead. You all, I think, have probably likely heard that as of last night, Trump signed another executive order banning transgender people in the military from serving in the military, and essentially reinstating what he had done during his first term. It is a really shocking document in many respects. First of all, it's a total and absolute ban on any transgender person serving in the military. And that includes people who are currently serving as openly transgender members of our armed forces who have done so based on reliance, that was something that was authorized by the military. And I will say, you know, I just want to really convey to people what is really happening in our community, because this executive order, which you should go and read, I'm not going to read it, but it has some really chilling language that is so dehumanizing and so delegitimizing of transgender people's existence that the only thing I could think about when I read it was going back to the 50s and 60s with the demonization of what was then called homosexuals, but in the McCarthy era by our government that was rooting out gay and lesbian people from federal employment based on these assertions of moral and psychological unfitness and inferiority. And so I just think it's important to understand that this is not even our movement as usual. We are facing sort of an attempt to deny people's very existence. And we're ready to fight back, and we are, but this is the terrain that we're in. Again, it's been a busy week at GLAD Law, and also for so many of our organizations around the country. Today, GLAD Law and the National Center for Lesbian Rights filed suit in federal court in Washington, D.C. on behalf of 6 active duty service members challenging the ban really, I think, demonstrating through our plaintiffs that this is an incredibly short-sighted and harmful policy for our military. The 6 people who are plaintiffs, and maybe somebody can put our press release into the chat. Our 6 plaintiffs have decades of education, training, and experience that we have paid for, that our country has invested in. And they are skilled members of our military, Navy pilots. They have received awards and commendations. And they are going to, the rooting out of transgender people from our military is going to actually make us less prepared, because we are losing an incredible amount of valuable experience in the name of military readiness. So you will be hearing a lot more about that lawsuit, as well as others around the country. That's sort of a quick summary of 2 of the major lawsuits that have happened this past week. But I want to turn it back now to Mary for some more discussion of the impact of the executive order.
Thank you, Ben. Did you want to say anything about the EO that just dropped?
I will hold that one for when I talk about healthcare.
Okay, fine. Very good.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you to my colleagues, and thank you all for joining tonight. I want to move to an issue that affects 47 million young people in communities large and small across this country. So I'm talking about schools. And I want to talk about 2 laws because there's been some confusion out there about them, and it's important to just be clear. One law that remains 100% in effect is Title IX, the Education Amendments Act of 1972, and it forbids discrimination based on sex in educational institutions and so on that receive federal funding. And that's just about everybody. So this non-discrimination rule applies in all aspects of educational activities. You can't be denied participation in activities, denied benefits, or be subjected to discrimination. Title IX has been vital, essential for improving opportunities, treatment, and funding for girls and women. And because sex, as a legal matter, is understood to encompass, among other things, discrimination because you don't conform to sex stereotypes or how a man or a woman or a girl or a boy should be, and because it includes transgender status, according to the Supreme Court in 2020, as well as sexual orientation, what this means is that Title IX has also become a very powerful tool for addressing discrimination against LGBTQ young people when they go to school. It's made a really big difference in ensuring opportunities, access to facilities, and being able to be in a learning environment where you can actually do what you're supposed to do, which is learn. I also want to say that Title IX is modeled on another law from 1964. It's called Title VI. And Title VI is very similar, but it forbids discrimination in programs and activities that receive federal funding, which again is going to be so many schools, based on race, color, and national origin. And of course, you could face discrimination on both, on multiple characteristics as one. So I just want to put that out there. These laws remain entirely enforceable, notwithstanding the executive order. So I want to just clear up an issue. One is, I think a lot of people have heard a lot of news about challenges to the Title IX regulations. So these Title IX regulations are the more detailed explanation of how to effectuate Title IX and make that, guarantee of non-discrimination and opportunity more vital. So they put out these regulations in August of 24, detailed rules about how Title IX works in practice, including on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. And the short version is that a number of states brought multiple lawsuits, and so did some anti-LGBTQ organizations, objecting in part because of the acknowledgement that sexual orientation and gender identity and trans status are included within the scope of sex discrimination. And just to get to the bottom line here, a Kansas court in January issued a nationwide order against the United States about enforcing these rules. They cannot be enforced. And normally there might be an appeal, but we now have a different administration that is probably not interested in defending the regulations in this instance. So this may be the end of that road. Having said all of that, does this mean Title IX is unenforceable? No, of course not. The regulations are the details. Title IX is the law and it remains intact. And again, it requires schools to provide, among others, LGBTQ+ students with equal educational opportunities And it still leaves to parents the ability to assert a right, including in court, for a equal educational environment. Okay, the other thing I wanted to say is the EO on sex. The US is only recognizing 2 sexes, clearly intended to deny rights, as has already been explained, to transgender and non-binary people. But again, the president cannot change the law with an executive order. And that is true here as well. So I just want to say that in addition to schools still being responsible to comply with Title IX in the ways that I've just described, there are also states that have their own laws governing education that say no sex discrimination, no sexual orientation discrimination, no transgender discrimination, no gender identity discrimination. And so some people really have double protections here. And again, remember, these things are enforceable. And I encourage people to step up when they need to. And we are concerned about the amount of discrimination and harassment we're hearing about. We have a survey. I hope that will go in the chat if you want to tell us about what is going on with you. The other thing I just wanted to lift up briefly is that sports has been in the news of late. School sports, the U.S. House of Representatives just recently passed a ban that still remains to be seen in the Senate. And I think what we would say about these total bans is that isn't there really a different way, rather than just categorically telling people they have no opportunity at all to play on a team, to learn how to be their best by working with other people, all the things that you can learn by playing sports and growing along with other people. And we think there surely needs to be much more individual assessment. There's got to be some way for everybody to participate, and a total ban is absolutely not that. And in that vein, onto the Senate, but I wanted to lift up a case that GLAAD is litigating in New Hampshire, which passed a ban on transgender girls playing sports in grades 5 to 12. And my colleagues, Ben Klein here and Chris Urschel, litigated on that and ultimately obtained a preliminary injunction from a federal court in New Hampshire saying this is sex discrimination. It's a violation of the equal protection laws. And this is really not okay. And the clients that we have in this case and their families have just been outstanding. And these are 2 girls, one who wants to keep playing soccer with her teammates, and the other who's hoping to play tennis and maybe do some track and field. And that's what we want for kids, to be able to do this rather than to be met with this buzzsaw of you are excluded because of who you are. So I now want to pivot to a different topic, if I may, which is marriage, because I've seen in the chat, there are a few questions about marriage, and I think we get questions about marriage every day. So I thought I would try to say a few things about that. I know people are worried about marriage and that these feel like, and in fact are, rather uncertain times. Family relationships are precious to all of us. So nobody wants to feel uncertainty about their families. And when it comes to marriage, I just want to say that we need to take stock of where we are right now. And where we are right now is that nothing has changed on the equal right to marry. The Supreme Court's Obergefell decision stands. And having said that, again, we get the concerns and we share concerns about living in a time of uncertainty. We do hear that there are people who are, rushing to marry. I'm not in a position to assess if they've rushed, but I just hope that people can do this because it really feels right for them. And congratulations, and not out of fear. Because what I want to say also is that this is not an easy issue for reversal. Okay, we're talking about the Supreme Court allegedly reversing itself here, and it's not a quick path either. So without laying out everything, because this is not a legal brief, here are a couple quick things I want to say. One is marriage is good for families. It is good for children. It is good for the larger society. It is good for the economy. These are all things the Supreme Court has said, and they remain true. And it's a good thing when more families have the protections and the security that marriage provides. That is what Obergefell did. And it would be outrageous to undo that. And I think we need to maintain that affect. It would be outrageous because there's no reason to do this. There's no reason to do this, number 2, because Obergefell was rightly decided. It is correct, constitutionally correct. And on two grounds. Obergefell said, this is a basic right, a basic liberty that we've had in this nation since before we even had the Constitution as we know it. And the court in Obergefell found a second basis for the right to marry, which was equal protection, that we all have the equal right to marry. And the court has used that time and again in striking down bans, for example, race-based bans, that were clearly a violation of equal protection, bans on incarcerated people from marrying, bans on people who couldn't pay their child support because they were too poor, to be able to pay it. They had a right to marry. So I just want to say there are very strong pillars based on long-standing precedents that support that decision. Now, again, even if some anti-LGBTQ group contrives a case and asks the U.S. Supreme Court to reverse Obergefell, please remember that the United States Supreme Court turns down 99% of the petitions it receives. It hears about 80 cases a year. So should a case or a petition to revisit Obergefell come to the court, the answer should be no. It should be denied, because we're talking about, with revisiting Obergefell, the potential disruption of protections to families and kids in their daily lives, something they count on day in and day out, and also to lots of other parties, the schools who want to know who is the family, policies of health insurance, who is in the family, renting or buying property, who are you to one another? Marriage is not everything, but it does simplify or provide a way for some people to tune into the issue of this is the family. They're not the only families, but this married families is something that the culture is keyed into. I also just want to say, this is so widely supported, it would be a bad PR move on their part. Okay, but another question we get all the time is, what about the Dobbs decision and the reversal of Roe versus Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood? And I understand that concern too. And without, again, laying out everything here, I want to offer two things. One is the court in Dobbs stated repeatedly that it was about abortion and not about other cases and not about marriage. We should hold them to that. Assuming we can't hold them to that, I would also say that in Obergefell, there was a strong, solid, winning argument on equality that was not any part of the Dobbs decision. It was decided under the liberty basis only. So more to say, but I would just put that out there. Another thing we're hearing about, just to keep introducing issues, is this Idaho resolution asking that, should it continue, it's now passed the House there, should it continue on to the Senate and so on, would ask the Supreme Court to reverse Obergefell. Can I tell you what that's worth? Nothing. Back in 1793, George Washington had some questions. He asked Thomas Jefferson to write a note to the court to ask for some guidance on something. And the court said, no, we, wrote a letter back and said, no, we cannot do that because we need an actual case or a controversy under the Constitution, under Article 3. We're not going to issue advisory opinions. So really, that's the sort of sad situation, I think, for Idaho, is should they even pass this, that it's not really going to have any particular effect. I also just want to say, should these proliferate in any way? And right now, Idaho, despite some press accounts, Idaho is the only one that is findable as pending. People have to remember, if this is a legislative process, we have a voice, and you can go in there and you can bring the grandparents and the kids and the cousins and the co-workers and everybody to say, this has been a great thing for this family. This is taking nothing away from me. This is good for our community, etc. So I just think, don't lose your voice. I also just need to add one other thing that is important for you to know. I'd like to end on a happy note here, which is that marriage is already rather protected on many levels. So there's two Supreme Court rulings, Obergefell, like I've talked about, from 2015, but also the Windsor decision striking down the Federal Defense of Marriage Act in 2013. Both are very powerful precedents. But the other thing I want to raise is the 2022 Respect for Marriage Act, which was passed by a bipartisan Congress. I'm talking about also got more than 60 votes in the US Senate. And that is such a rarity Okay, so this Respect for Marriage Act, to boil it down, requires respect for marriages that were valid where they were performed. As long as it was valid there, it would be valid in other states, regardless of what their underlying law is, okay? Regardless of how hostile it may be, but we require respect from states and also from the federal government. And even should Obergefell be reversed, which it should not, I want to say there are going to remain states who will not flinch and who will welcome people to marry in their states. So I want to just stop there and turn it. Do we want to take questions now, or do we want to turn it over to Polly?
I think I'm just going to jump in to say, I was going to talk a little bit about parentage and protecting your family. I think we have a tremendous amount of resources about that on the our website, and that we can also put into put out for folks. So I think I'm going to turn it back to Ben to talk about healthcare, because I'm sure that is also very top of folks' mind.
Right. Well, thank you, Polly. Thank you, Mary. So much going on these days, but we do want to give some focus to healthcare. Healthcare is vital. It's vital for everybody. And we know there's a lot of concern and worry and anxiety out there about healthcare for transgender people and what may be coming down the pike for folks. So I want to start by just giving us a little bit of perspective from looking back at the past 10 or 15 years. Over the last 10, 15 years, we have made tremendous progress in the law and in policy, expanding access to healthcare for transgender people. Today, as a result of that 10 to 15 years of progress, we have a very substantial body of legal precedent that recognizes the legitimacy of gender dysphoria as a diagnosis, and that recognizes the efficacy and medical necessity of the standard of care medical treatments for gender dysphoria. So that's point one, okay? But along with that, we have also a very substantial body of law now from a range of federal and state courts across this country, ruling that categorical exclusions of gender transition medical care are unlawful. Okay, and we have cases in a variety of settings, whether it's commercial insurance, Medicaid, public employee benefit plans, self-funded employer benefit plans. There is a very, a very substantial body of case law that we are working from. So I want people to understand that, because we are seeing attacks, and we've been seeing attacks for a while, and we have that body of case law to rely on. The other thing, as many people know, there is a very important case in the U.S. Supreme Court now, LW versus Scrimetti, that is addressing the issue of whether bans that states have passed on healthcare for transgender adolescents are subject to are sex discrimination, are basically sex-based classifications, and as such, those laws would be subjected to a much higher level of scrutiny. In other words, the government has to do much more under a sex-based classification to actually justify why it's passing a law. Now, that case oral argument was heard in December, and although I know a lot of people have concerns about our Supreme Court, people who really know the court, who listened to the argument, analyzed it, have really expressed some optimism about the outcome of that case. Now, of course, we do not know what the court is going to rule. We also have other legal theories that we use in these cases, so it's not a all or nothing proposition, but that case is out there as a very important part of the legal environment right now. But, as we all know, we are working from a really strong legal position on healthcare issues, but we know that there have been attacks in the past years. There's over 26 states that have banned medical care for transgender adolescents, and we know more attacks are coming, and we're ready for them. So one thing that happened, some people may know this, but in January, the Congress, when it passed the Defense Authorization Act, essentially setting appropriations and other policy for the military, passed a law that banned certain kinds of medical care for transgender adolescents to be covered under the military's health plan for dependents of military personnel. We are aware of that. It's in the sights of the LGBTQ legal organizations. That law will be challenged. Now, one other thing that just happened, and we are living in a world where every time you look at the news, there's more disturbing things. I try not to look at the news as much anymore, but just as we were preparing and literally logging on, the four of us, to this webinar, we heard news reports that Trump had issued another executive order that is attempting or purports to ban medical care for transgender adolescents across the country in any federally funded facility. We understand that is scary, that is concerning, that is shocking. We are still looking at it. It literally just came out. We are looking at it. We're going to be analyzing it tonight. But I think what we want people to understand is this is their strategy. They are coming at us all in this first week to instill fear, to intimidate, to cause panic. And this is what we were ready for and have been preparing for. That executive order, and we still don't know how federal agencies are going to implement it, but that executive order is going to be challenged. Okay, so please know that. And you know, these are shocking orders, though, because it really should be parents who have the freedom to make responsible decisions about their children's health care. We expect that, courts will understand that. So, I think now we have some time for questions. Sorry to end on a note of uncertainty, but it kind of reflects the times we're in. We are literally facing new things every day. And we are marshaling all the resources we can at GLAAD, and we know our partner organizations are too across the country, to really take these things on and protect our community.
So I just want to know that there's over 100 questions that we're likely not to get to tonight. I know that some of these are very individualized and very specific. So the first thing that I would say is that for folks who are new to us and are unfamiliar with our GLAAD Law Answers dedicated line, we're going to put the information on the chat so that folks understand how they can reach us to ask those questions and receive answers to them. I think Amanda has noted that within some of the answers to some of the existing questions, but we are saving all of the questions that are being asked and are going to do our best to try to answer them for folks, even if it's post this webinar.
Ricardo, I'm sorry, I just want to make one more important point along the same lines of resources, if that's okay. Sure. I forgot to mention, but it's so important, I want to mention it, that, we get a lot of individual questions about healthcare. People are very concerned, and we have created a document that I hope Quinn or Amanda can put in the chat for people, that kind of gives people some guidance on an individualized basis about what you can be doing and should be doing to protect yourself on an individual level. Obviously, we're talking about challenging laws, but we also have guidance for people about what to think about and what to keep in mind. Sorry for interrupting, Ricardo. I just wanted to make sure we got that document to folks.
You're good, Ben. Thank you. I'm looking at the questions now. Amanda, are there specific ones that you want to uplift?
Yes, I mean, there's obviously a lot of individual questions. A lot of people have noted that executive order that just dropped tonight. So thanks, Ben. There are a couple of questions about whether executive orders have any impact or interplay with state law. And I'll maybe just give you a couple. A question about impacts on healthcare and funding issues related to HIV and PrEP access, if there are things to be concerned about there as well.
I mean, I'll start with the first one, but I want to invite Polly and Mary, who've really thought about this, to jump in as well. I mean, executive orders cannot impact state law. On the other hand, they can impact people in states, right? Because of their breadth around federal funding and so forth. So it's important to keep in mind that there are still state law protections state statutes don't change, state school board policies don't change, but you know, obviously federal actions can still have an impact because of the breadth of, you know, federal activity like federal funding. But I want to, before I want to answer the HIV question, but before I do that, I just want to invite Mary or Paul if you have anything to add sort of on the interplay here.
I mean, I'll just hop in to say, like, let's take gender markers, for example. I mean, obviously, everybody's individual situation has to be assessed individually. And again, we have pro bono resources for that. And that, like, nothing about state law and your ability to get a birth certificate or a name change under state law changes as a result of this executive order, right? Birth certificates are state documents. And of course, if you were born out of the United States, that's a different situation. And also in terms of parentage, right? Again, parentage is defined by the state. It's one of the reasons why we've been working really hard to update state parentage laws to ensure paths to parentage for more people to protect their children. So if you're a parent under a state law, you're a parent. So there's just two pieces I wanted to share, and I'll pass it to Mary.
I'm just going to confirm this, that generally it's going to be directed to the federal government and what they do, but Ben is right that what they do, if should they pass a law, for example, would have an effect. So sometimes the president is sort of urging or directing people to do things, and the Congress takes it up and so on, or there's regulatory changes. Again, these things don't happen overnight. Then yeah, then there could be, but right now that's not what we're looking at. Again, I haven't read the order from tonight.
Yeah. And just briefly on HIV and access to PrEP, I think that was the question. One of the things that was really interesting to me when we were looking at Project 2025 before the election, trying to get some handle on what might happen if Trump won, was there really was an absence of anything about HIV. And so it was sort of interesting that that was not on their sort of culture war agenda. But we do know that there'll be impacts in a couple of different ways, potentially, of things that are going on. One is we don't really know what's going on with our public health infrastructure at the federal level. We have people coming in to the potentially to the Department of Health and Human Services, to the FDA, to the CDC, who are, you know, intent on disrupting systems that have protected us in the past from pandemics that we need for disease surveillance, for approval of new drugs, for example, new forms of PrEP. So there's the potential for some disruption there. But the major thing that's happening on the federal level now is a case before the US Supreme Court that involves an issue where under the Affordable Care Act, certain preventive therapies that have been given an A or B rating by the government have to be covered by health insurance plans without any cost sharing to the consumer. So and PrEP is one of those designated preventive services. So right now, your PrEP, you shouldn't be paying any copays for PrEP. Including lab services, right, under the ACA. But there is a court decision where that's at issue, where some conservative businessmen in Texas have challenged that. We don't know quite what's happening with the case because we don't know how the Trump administration is going to handle the case. Because the case was actually being defended by the Biden administration, Department of Justice, but it's just something, it's not any immediate threat to PrEP, but it could be way down the road in the future in terms of eliminating the prohibition on cost sharing.
A couple of folks have asked a question about the other executive order that was a freeze on federal funding. And I don't know if anyone can speak to the impacts of that.
Well, in the good news, I did, I thought I saw a news report that a judge had just blocked that. So things are happening, lawsuits are flying around all over the place. It's one of those things, I think there was massive confusion about it, quite frankly. I think I heard a news report today that the Trump administration clarified it only applied to, DEI programs or something very limited. But I think, it's just an example of they are just letting these things fly without any sense of precision or discipline. And there was just complete confusion and chaos about what this really meant. So I don't know. I have a feeling if you check your news reports that might be blocked for now, but also I haven't heard anything specific. It's just too early. I haven't heard anything specific about impact on various programs.
Another ID doc related question is a question regarding about the real IDs. Have we heard anything about any impacts on that at this point?
I just want to jump in and say, be 100% honest, I haven't analyzed that issue yet. Clearly, we have a lot of work to do to analyze a number of issues, and I really appreciate the questions that are flowing in the chat. They're great questions, and we appreciate your input and feedback, and it's one we'll take a look at.
Maybe one last question. I'm seeing a few questions about the Bureau of Prisons executive order, and I know that that is an ongoing, that's already been challenged, but there's a question about whether we think that would have any impact on state prison policies.
It doesn't. It's directed to federal prisons, to the the EO is directed to the Attorney General, the Department of Homeland Security. So it should not impact state prisons.
All right, everybody. We are nearing the end of our hour, but I do want to just remind folks that for those who did not have their questions answered, or if you have additional questions post this webinar, you can contact us for free and confidential legal information, assistance, or referrals at gladanswers@glad.org, or you can leave a voicemail when calling 800-455-GLAD, GLAD. We have created a lot of Know Your Rights resources that are related to topics that Polly talked about, that Mary talked about, that Ben talked about, but go into more detail. And that includes marriage and relationship protections, family protections, healthcare access, schools, identity documents, name changes, and online safety. So those are accessible by going to glad.org. And right at the very top of your web browser, you'll see on the left-hand side of the page, there should be a link for accessing those Know Your Rights resources. A lot of folks have also been asking how to help. There are some things that you can do moving forward. These are some of the options that we gave the last time that we came together post election, but continuing to educate yourself and your family and friends on policy issues affecting our community is of utmost importance at the moment. If you don't already follow us on social media, a lot of our webinar announcements, some of the Know Your Rights, and some of the education and information about briefings that are upcoming to some of these continuing developing issues will be socialized there. Getting involved with your state and local equality groups, I think, is really important. Continuing to expand civic engagement spaces is incredibly important at the moment. Contacting your elected officials and letting them know how angry, frustrated you are, and to push back against anti-LGBTQ legislation or to support stronger legal protections for our community. Attending local school board meetings are incredibly important as well. A hyper-local context in our own communities is very important. There will be moments that call for large protests and direct action. You can help by participating there. If that does not feel tangible, a call, an email, or directly volunteering with some of the organizations that need additional capacity right now is another way to not only be in community, but feel impactful and feel like you're doing your part. Also, participating in mutual aid networks is really important at the moment to help LGBTQ people and people living with HIV get their basic needs met. And donating to pro-equality organizations are also important. In moments like this, as I mentioned before, I really do want to remind myself and anchor myself in the truth of who we are versus who we are made out to be by folks that don't necessarily support our community. In these moments, I think about Marsha P. Johnson, who used to say that the P in her name stood for pay it no mind. And I know that that is very hard to do at the moment. It's not easy, but we have to try to find our value and worth in ourselves and in the love that our chosen family gives us. I also remember the Second National March on Washington back in 1987, and it was held with acts of civil disobedience and mass weddings and the reveal of the AIDS quilt. And at that time, it felt like a really perilous time as it does now. And just seeing that many people do their part and, turn out and remain engaged in our democracy is incredibly important. And lastly, I also think about Raquel Willis, who recently said that no one gave us our identities, and so no one can take them away. We are a very vibrant community that always emerges from internal exile, anchored in fear, to embark on a journey of resistance, defiance, deeper unity, healing, and reconciliation. And together, I know that we will show the world that not only is discrimination against any kinds, against the LGBTQ community not accepted, but that we have come too far in advancing LGBTQ rights to go back. This fight belongs to all of us. Thank you for joining us. And again, if your question was not answered, we're going to try to get it. And we will circle back. Thank you very much to everyone who has joined us. Thank you to Polly, to Ben, to Mary, to Amanda, to Braden, who helped us with the technology, and everyone who contributed to today.